After a bloody civil war between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Republic of China was born. Mao Zedong, the leader of this country, had ambitious ideas to transform this country into a communist paradise. Yet, much had to be done. China's economic system, one based mostly in agriculture, had to move towards industrialization. In his 1956 Socialist High Tide campaign, Mao attempted to do so by collectivizing farms and grains, yet this was not enough, as industrial shortages were high. Many economists, agricultural specialists and party members criticised this campaign for attempting to do all things overnight. Mao, who appeared to be open to these criticisms, took advantage of this situation to eliminate those who might question the party. Mao and his closest allies realised that it would be unwise to listen to experts, as they would always be against or doubtful of the means through which China progressed towards communism. This rejection of expertise would later unleash one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history. In 1957, Mao assisted the 40th anniversary celebration of the October Revolution in Moscow. Throughout his lifetime, the Chinese leader attempted to become the leader of the communist bloc, yet he would always be second to his neighbour to the north, the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader at the time, took advantage of this celebration to brag about how the Soviets had outperformed the Western Allies, specifically the United States, in industrial output. Feeling insecure as his capabilities as a leader, Mao took advantage of this showing off and declared that China would outstrip Britain in a few years in industrial output, just as the Soviets had done with the United States. This rash pledge, driven by insecurity and rivalry, marked the beginning of the Great Leap Forward, a Chinese economic and social experiment that would become the biggest famine the world has ever known. Back in China, Mao got his closest advisors to work. A new approach had to be created to avoid another failed industrialization campaign. However, not everyone agreed on how to approach this transformation, such as Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, who harshly opposed the mission, tagging the campaign as a rash advance. Others argued that the Soviet model should be followed. If it worked for the Russians, why not for the Chinese? Mao, annoyed by this negativism, argued that the Chinese leadership poured cold water on people's enthusiasm. He also argued that China, instead of developing one industry at the time, should walk on two legs, working on both agriculture and industry simultaneously. Remembering past purging of those against his plan, nobody dared to oppose this mission. Mao's thinking apparently was perfect and had to be followed strictly as Mao dictated. Those who opposed were exchanged by a loyalist, were worked to death, or committed suicide. There was a strong belief in Mao's China that men could transform nature in whichever they wanted, whether it was by killing certain types of animals to maintain crops or manipulating water streams. The Mao regime played with nature, often doing it wrongly. Mao's Great Leap Forward manifested itself as first by many irrigation campaigns, the first one being the dam on the Yellow River. The Yellow River would be one of the first victims of Mao's manipulation of nature. The river, which is known to be extremely turbulent and full of sediment, impeded the growing of grains near it, as they would constantly be flooded. For this, Mao decided it would be a good idea to build a dam. However, not everybody was on board with this idea. Huang Wanli, a geologist, argued this was not the best approach. Building a dam to block dirt would cut the construction's lifespan and cause a natural disaster. Mao, thinking he knew better, ignored this warning. Another irrigation project which attempted to build a reservoir in Mingtobs was also a disaster. Experts argued that the reservoir was built in the wrong place, causing every field around it to dry up. Although this work was completely in vain, it would also be extremely cruel on workers, mostly farmers, who often worked for 10 hours without break, had limited amounts of food, and were beaten if they dared to complain. The results of all of this: 0 irrigated hectares, 150 million yuan spent, 600,000 work days, many deaths due to horrible work conditions and slave work. Unfortunately, this was just the beginning. In the small county of Zhoushui, party leaders decided to divide collective farms into large entities. These farms were divided into battalions, companies and platoons. Through this method, around 100,000 men were working on the fields. This approach of combining economic advancement and military precision fascinated Mao. He wanted this to be replicated throughout China. Nobody, not even women, had an excuse to not work, as the government provided nurseries and retirement places to children and the elderly. The Chinese leadership was euphoric. They thought that these union of forces would cause a food surplus in 10 years, free for everyone, as if this method was a golden bridge to communism. Their expectations regarding how long this would take shortened. It was declared that China would take over Britain by 1963, as well as the arrival of communism. Nonetheless, as euphoric CCP leadership was, villagers on the field were not. Since agriculture had been transformed into a military-like exercise, discipline was enforced with punishment and beatings. No one was a farmer anymore, but a soldier working for the arrival of communism. As well, collectivization went further. Since everything was owned by everyone, money was no longer needed. Each worker would be given points dependent of how much they worked, their age and gender. This system was used as a way to punish people for not working hard enough or not working at all, since how much points you had affected how much food you would get at the canteens. With this collectivization campaigns, people killed livestock for their own consumption, hid grain and sold assets. Yet this would all be in vain. Even homes were dismantled, their bricks repurposed for communal facilities or ground into fertilizer. In addition to permanent work in the fields, farmers were expected to also contribute to the fabrication of steel in the farms. This would be done by putting small furnaces, mostly made from sand, stone, fire clay or bricks. Villagers were expected to provide floorboards and chicken feathers to feed flames. Even working tools used by farmers to work on fields was collected to make iron. Between farmers, working on the furnaces was known as launching a satellite. People hated to do it because it meant, according to a farmer, another bitter war during night in which nobody could go to sleep. Working in iron furnaces was so despised that local party cadres inflated the reported output to party leadership and let people not work on it. All these efforts were also in vain, as the iron produced was too small to be used industrially. Not even 1/3 of the iron produced was acceptable. It is important to point out that hunger was already a pressing issue throughout China before the Great Leap Forward. Yet this national experiment made it much more endemic and acute. The very first cases of starvation appeared in February 1958, where cases of edema or water retention was widespread. This disease, which manifests itself by water retention throughout the body, is caused by a lack of protein, a symptom of malnutrition. Medical teams at the time were too afraid to call the leadership out for this. Due to the big amount of people dying, farmers started calling their workplace the killing fields. In Chahua, 1 in 6 villagers died every day between January and August 1958, totaling 1,610 people In Kujing, 82,000 people died in 1958. Births decreased by 55% in just 1 year. The Chinese leadership knew people were dying, especially Mao, who received reports from across the country. Suffering people, local party cadres or investigators sent him letters the whole time. Instead of blaming his plan for the suffering of many, Mao started blaming his colleagues and local party cadres for disrupting with the campaign. Not much was done to prevent the famine, as it was seen that a future with a lot for all would largely compensate for the present suffering of the few. Even the Chinese foreign minister argued that this is, I quote, the price to pay. Even as Chinese society struggled through harsh weeks of famine, each citizen was treated differently depending on where they lived. For instance, those living in Shanghai would be considered as city dwellers and receive a variety of benefits, such as food rations, subsidised housing, education, among other benefits. Peasants, as farmers were called, did not have these benefits. As well, the number of farmers that could go to the cities was extremely limited due to the massive workforce that was needed in the fields. Under extreme hunger conditions and a bad workplace, farmers did anything to gain food. The easiest way to do so was stealing. No one was saved from it. From the lowest strata of the social hierarchy within a common to the local party cadre, everyone stole. Collected grain in the fields would be stolen and replaced by water to make it seem heavier. Store clerks forged fake purchase receipts and steel products. Local party cadres had 2 books, one with the fake numbers given to the state and the real one. While central CCP leadership seemed to be indifferent towards the suffering of farmers, it is known that many local cadres, seeing the suffering in their daily lives, were the ones to distribute this grain and deliberately lie to the state to save people. Not every farmer stayed in the commune. There was a massive exodus of farmers to the cities, a place in where they would get better jobs and more benefits. Between 1957 and 1960, around 31 million farmers left the countryside. Yet unfortunately, they did not receive the same benefits as city dwellers. Although food was much more accessible, the government realised how overpopulated cities were, mandating the return of farmers to the countryside. Yet many stayed unlawfully, often having to steal or prostitute themselves for a living. It is estimated that the Great Leap Forward, the aforementioned economic and social experiment to beat Britain in industrial output, caused around 15 to 55 million casualties, according to estimates. It is debatable as to whether this famine was caused by natural effects such as droughts, floods, etc. Yet, what cannot be disregarded is that this famine and its victims are due to the bad planning and often the stubbornness of the Chinese government regarding its plan. From the very beginning of the campaign, those who had spoken against it were experts in their field. Mao and his leadership decided to purge them from society as they were hurting the people's ambition. They believed they knew better, that their comrade thinking would help them in their shortcomings. They were wrong. Even to the very last moment, Mao was convinced that his plan was perfect, and those hurting it were the local party cadres and remaining rightists. Yet someone brave named Liu Shaoqi decided to call him out for his actions. Liu, the Chinese head of the state, gave a speech on January 1962 declaring that the difficulties were 30% due to natural calamities and 70% due to man-made disaster. It was the first time a major CCP officer publicly declared that the famine was a man-made disaster, causing Mao a huge backlash within the party in following years. It is even reported that between the two there was a heated conversation in which Liu told Mao, "History will judge you and me." These public and private remarks would cost Liu his life, which would later be taken by Mao and the CCP during the following Cultural Revolution, a cult of personality campaign to fix the country's public opinion of communism and CCP leadership following this disaster. No one and nothing will back the millions of lives that were lost during this disaster. Yet the best we can do for these individuals is to remember how their lives and their way of living was changed by a regime who imposed a view and way of doing things with contempt of disagreement. Let's do not let the memory of this die.